May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. A few quick notices and very much Book of Common Prayer style before the sermon. Just to note that some of the technical difficulties we've had today is that the church has had a bit of a busy life over the last few days. Friday saw it fairly much reconfigured as we had the celebration of the marriage of Catherine Dunstall and Matthew Foreman here. The first church wedding that we've had actually in a couple of years in this building. So a wonderful celebration, but it does mean little gremlins are in the system all over the place. And in addition to that, some of that is why Peter is presiding this morning, and as well as preaching at the 10 a.m. service where I'll be presiding, just to balance some of the load as we come into a fairly busy week as well. So apologies for some of the little problems that have happened throughout today, a little bit of a result of the space being well used. The thing that I wanted to note today, though, is that being St. James, the brother of Jesus, the New Zealand Lectionary does this beautiful thing where it kind of almost goes Control F, if you know how to use Microsoft Word, and then types in James or some vague thing related to that idea, and then goes, right, we'll have that reading. It's not a very sophisticated system, it seems, occasionally when you come to Saints' Days and when you come to days, holy days in general. The lectionary just sort of picks and chooses where it needs to. But today's readings are actually a wonderful combination of something that is captured and central to the life of James, the brother of Jesus, which is the question, how does one come to God? How does one actually come to faith? How can one believe? Now there is a profound and deep question in that I cannot answer in the sort of 10 to 15 minutes you may allow me before you start jeering. But in terms of the conversation that has begun in these scriptures, there is something essential and important to the question of it. And it really begins with the story of Jacob and Esau. Now, most of you are well informed enough in scripture to know the story of Jacob and Esau, the brother who stole the blessing, or borrowed the blessing, perhaps is another way of putting it, at the behest of his mother, and then the enmity and the division that was caused by that. And then we carry on, we don't really get much about Esau, but we certainly get a lot about Joseph, and his story of dealing with the guilt and the fear and the challenge that results from that an internal sense of, how am I going to confront this thing that is broken? How am I going to confront this man that I have usurped in some way? And then we come to the glorious reading we have today, as brothers wrap arms around one another and tears flow. And the demands of sort of reconciliation, which are so culturally bound, the idea that there should be gifts and there should be sacrifice and there needs to be some kind of even blood, are gone. He is simply forgiven and embraced as a brother. Now, if we think culturally throughout the world, both within European cultures and in cultures that have in Africa and South America and in New Zealand, the concept of reconciliation has always involved process. There are actions that need to be undertaken. In some contexts, there is the idea that an eye for an eye essentially needs to be played out. That if you have stolen my wife, I will have to steal your wife in order to balance out the wrong that is in your midst. Or perhaps if you have greatly harmed me, there needs to be some ritual action. In Polynesia, sometimes they come underneath mats and crawl towards the person that they have harmed in this action of reconciliation. Now, those are beautiful and powerful. Some of them are terrifying. But today, in the reading we have from Genesis, those cultural customs are not there. There is just simply embrace. There is almost this mirror of the prodigal son. And then we encounter Jesus coming to his hometown of Nazareth, encountering his friends, those who went to school with, perhaps, if there was such a thing as a school at the time. It was a very varied experience of that. Standing there amongst them, and if, depending on how you read this particular gospel part within the wider gospel stories, having spoken at the synagogue, the people doubt him. Isn't this Mary's son? actually they say, isn't this Joseph's son, which in the Gospel of Matthew, having begun with such a strong genealogy where it was clear that Jesus is sort of the adoptive child of Jesus, there is this sort of twist of a knife that's involved in that sentence. We encounter this first barrier to the possibility of belief, familiarity. And it is one that the traditional churches know extraordinarily well, unfortunately. When we come to the story of Easter, when we come to the story of Christmas, even when we come to the story of the crucifixion and resurrection in other periods of time, the wonder and the power of it is somewhat lost on us. Oh, that's just Luke's version of that story. Or that's just that person's interpretation of that story. Some of the profundity that would have hit those first disciples the first time they heard that is lost. Isn't that just Mary's son? Aren't his brothers amongst us? The thing that Jesus stepped into in that moment was that people were still gathering, though. They still had this innate sense that there was a God that needed to be acknowledged, a God that needed to be worshipped, a God with whom there was some blockage, some preventative reality. In the actions of the temple, the people of the Jewish religion found their means of atonement with that God, this prefiguring of the Christian story. But equally, in those earlier customs of reconciliation between peoples, there was a microcosm, a small variation or a small reality of the bigger reality of people coming back to God in reconciliation. If this is how we reconcile with one another, how are we to reconcile with God? And so if there is ritual and practice between you and I, where there is breakage, there must be ritual and practice between me and God, between us and God. But then we have Jacob and Esau. The story of two disparate, distanced, broken brothers coming together with open arms and graceful embrace. Now, James, the brother of Jesus, is a challenging figure. The reason the lectionary struggles to find readings about him is because none of them are particularly good. When he does encounter Jesus in many of the Gospels, he'll say something like, "Don't worry about him, he's just a bit nuts," basically, is his reaction in the other Gospel readings. And then we have our reading here, "Isn't he just the brother of James?" The sense of pushing down. And I can understand that. If your brother or your sister or someone related to you said that I am the living vine, you might think they might need some help. So you can understand James's position. But following the resurrection of Jesus, this story transforms. The story changes dramatically. In fact, it's one of the stories that kind of gives us that sense of evidentiary life for something around the resurrection, because this man, James, goes from doubter to believer, doubter to leader of the church in Jerusalem, of all places. But more so, his life and his impact is captured in our reading from Acts. This reading that captures the end of the first ecumenical council of the church, the Council of Jerusalem, where it was decided that Gentiles were not required to live by the Mosaic law. They were not required to face circumcision. They were not required to follow the 619 or 20 odd commandments that earlier in the scripture, we didn't capture it today, but Peter says, "How dare we put the yoke around the Gentiles that we are and our ancestors haven't been able to bear?" And we encounter this in James's story, this capturing of the prodigal son, this capturing of the story of Jacob and Esau in James's command. We should do nothing to get in the way of the Gentiles coming to Jesus, or coming to God. We should do nothing to get in the way of the Gentiles coming to faith. He had recognized in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that God is not a God that demands ritual engagement. God is not a God that demands us to undergo particular rites and passages in order to be found acceptable. James has discovered in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that God is like Esau. Yes, there is distance, and yes, there is brokenness, and yes, we are going to break things still, but there is open arms. There is loving embrace. There is the tear rolling down the cheek of both God and the reconciled person, the reconciled people. The story of James, the brother of Jesus, sorry, I had Joseph stuck in my head there for a moment, of James, the brother of Jesus, is the story of recognizing that God is not far and distant and angry and scary, but that rather God is grace. God is love. God is arms wide open. And so the question falls back to us as the church today. In that same sense, we gather here this morning as the apostles and the teachers and others did in Jerusalem. And we ask, what are we doing to bring the Gentiles to God? To help bring the Gentiles to God? And what are we doing that is making it hard? When I think of my own faith story, there are elements of the story of Jesus within it, the story of James within it. I, at a very young age, and I've told some of this story before, and I will stop talking in a moment, I promise. A very young age, I encountered the belligerence and the nastiness of the church. My mother was a Christian. I was extraordinarily unwell. They prayed for me. I wasn't healed, and so the email came into my mother's inbox. Clearly you don't have enough faith. Clearly he doesn't have enough faith. And that moment, I think I was about 13 years old, I swore off God. Didn't work that well, but I swore off God and I swore off the church because I wanted nothing to do with it. And it is part of the story of why I am in the Anglican church, the response to that reality. So we do things as church that prevent and put people off. But like the brother of Jesus, we also do things that make things far too familiar. We very loosely throw the idea of grace at people. So much so that in the language of Bonhoeffer, we can cheapen it to the point where it seems to have no real cost. But the reason that God can embrace us in grace and in love is not because God has just freely forgiven, but because in Jesus Christ we meet the merger of God's justice, which is absolute and ultimate, and God's mercy, which is embracing and loving. In the cross, we encounter the true cost that God is willing to pay for us. But we encounter also the true grace that welcomes us like Esau with open arms. So as you think about the God that you worship today, how is that God like Esau? How is that God like the prodigal son's father? Or how much is that God like the God of those Pharisees and the sect that raised the question, no, these Gentiles must be circumcised. No, these Gentiles must follow the law. How much is our God a God of embrace? And how much is our God a God of must? Amen.